Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Decolonizing Justice, or good morning to those of you in Alaska or Hawaii or points west. I'm Liz Keith. I'm the program director with Burnett, and on behalf of the Decolonizing Justice Steering Committee, I'm delighted to have everybody back with us today and would like to extend a warm welcome to those joining for the first time this week, as well as our panelists for this afternoon's session on critical participatory action research. Just a few logistics and suggestions before we start. We have hundreds of people who have registered over the course of this week for various sessions, representing more than 30 states in the US and other communities in North America and beyond, and would love to hear more about who you are and where you're joining us from. So please go ahead and share that in the chat. We also, as always, invite you to share your feedback and your observations and questions about our topic today through the chat and Q&A boxes in Zoom, and also to use the event Slack space to connect with each other and continue discussions about these topics online. So I also wanted to thank my colleagues at Burnett who are helping with live note-taking today for those of you that would like to follow along or find that helpful. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to our event facilitator, Jenny Rose Halperin, whose address will show here. And with that, I am delighted to turn the introductions for this next session and panel over to Matthew Burnett, Policy Officer with the Open Society Justice Initiative and a member of this event steering committee.
Great, thanks so much, Liz, and welcome everyone. We're now on day 3 of this convening, and it's been incredible just to share space with all of you, all of our panelists, and develop community around the commitments we're making to understand and approach ways in which we critically examine access to justice and legal empowerment in this context. I'm really delighted to be able to have the panelists that we have for this session today, and we'll introduce them momentarily. But for now, I just wanted to start with a brief overview of the session, which is really going to focus on sort of methodological commitments around critical participatory action research, which is probably a set of approaches that is new to many of us. I think it's very exciting to think about the ways in which these approaches can inform our work, both in terms of how we center community and in terms of how we collect data and understanding from communities, and then transform that into research outputs that help us to more systemically address some of the underlying issues that affects the communities that we work with and that we support. This session is going to take a deep dive into the Public Science Project, which for 25 years has worked with community-based organizations, with activists, lawyers, young people, older people, to produce research rooted in the perspectives of those most impacted by injustice, and to document the structural inequalities and build empirical data for policy, for organizing, and for public education, all of which are critical to legal empowerment and community-based justice. The panelists today are going to discuss 2 projects. The first is going to be the Morris Justice Project, which is a multi-year collaboration with community residents in the Bronx, New York, where researchers together with lawyers systemically and qualitatively documented the impact of the aggressive policing on youth and adults and elderly through innovative kind of secondary analysis of New York Police Department data conducted with the community and original data that was connected through a community-generated survey. And then the second project is going to focus on a project called the Survivors Justice Project, which is relatively new. It was launched in 2020, and it works to document and animate the impact of the 2019 Domestic Survivors Justice Act in New York, alongside the women who are most impacted by it, women who are incarcerated. So through these examples, the hope is that we'll explore some of the key commitments, the possibilities, and the collaborative engagement on these projects, and through that hope to make clear just how and why it's so critical that the most impacted by injustice are situated at the center of research. So with that, I just want to briefly introduce each of the panelists. We'll start off with Michelle Fine, who is a professor of critical psychology, urban education, American studies, and women's studies at the Graduate Center of CUNY. She's engaged in critical participatory research for educational, racial, and gender justice. Her most recent book, which is amazing, I actually read it maybe a year ago before I met Michelle, is called Just Research in Contentious Times, and it's available through the Teachers College Press. We'll also have Maria Elena Torre, who is the director of Public Science Project and a faculty member in critical social psychology at the Urban Education and Urban Education at CUNY Graduate Center. She is the mom of a very cool 11-year-old, and she has conducted written about critical participatory action research for the last 20 years. Methodologies and radical inclusion inform that work. I'm getting a signal that my internet connection is unstable, so I'm going to turn off my video and try to prevent that. And hopefully this is better, and folks can nod at me, panelists, if it feels better. Okay, apologies for that. We all compete for internet bandwidth these days. The third panelist is Kate Mobilescu, who is an associate professor of clinical law at Brooklyn Law School, where she founded and runs the Criminal Defense and Advocacy Clinic. She's a public defender of nearly 20 years, and she focuses on the criminalization of survivors of domestic violence and sexual exploitation. And then finally, we hope to have join us Sharon White Harngen, who is the executive director of the Women's Community Justice Association and an advisory member of the DVSJA working group, the domestic violence project that we'll be discussing, and is co-creator of the Justice for Women Task Force. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Michelle, who's going to get us started. And just so folks know, if you want to put questions into the chat box or the Q&A as we go, that would be fantastic. We're going to plan to take a bit of a pause after Michelle and Maria give their presentations to take some questions, and then we'll move on and have Kate and Sharon share with us. So Michelle, over to you.
Good, wonderful. And of course, Sharon is here, and she always is always here. Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Fine. I teach at the CUNY Graduate Center, and with Maria Torre, I'm connected to the Public Science Project. And as Matt indicated, today we're going to take a deep dive into two projects that are affiliated with the Public Science Project. To begin, let us all acknowledge the stolen land we stand on, and recognize that our research is also dedicated to reclaiming stolen land and rights and dignities and languages and knowledges. And I want to thank Matt and Liz and Jenny for inviting us. And we are going to set this up so that I'm going to frame some of the key commitments of critical participatory action research, and then do a deep look at a relatively long-term project, the Marsh Justice Project, and then a newer but no less invigorating and thrilling project. So let me begin with some kind of critical commitments of critical participatory action research. And let me say that we often work with lawyers on issues of criminal and civil and human rights. We're often, and at this point, almost always working to accompany and ally ourselves with social movements for justice and communities under siege. Let me also say that critical participatory action research, we think of it as an epistemology, not a method. It's not a way to do research. It's a way to appreciate that knowledge is widely distributed, even though legitimacy is not. So those of us with PhDs or those of you with lawyers are presumed to know far more about the context in which people are living. And critical par is a refusal of that presumption that expertise only lies with heightened credentials. And in fact, critical par is a recognition that there is knowledge and wisdom most acutely held by those most impacted by social injustice. And from the point of view of Maria, myself as social scientists, we would argue that there should be no research done on communities, but only research by and with. So we come from a long history of social scientists who have been involved in what's considered extractive practices, taking research out of communities and then publishing on it. And our commitments are to create research practices alongside in solidarity with. We might use quantitative methods, we might use surveys, we might even use randomized clinical trials. Happy to chat about that. We might use ethnography, interviews, art, performance, music. There are a variety of methods which you will hear today. But the first and primary commitment of critical par is that knowledge is widely distributed, even if legitimacy is not, and people most impacted by injustice have the right to research. And those of us who are privileged to work alongside communities that are deeply impacted need to bring our resources and responsibilities and privilege, but also bring a kind of humility and understanding there are many kind of knowledges. The second commitment of critical par is to challenge dominant narratives, that is, the stories told about the communities we work with. So we're not just interested in honoring the wisdom in impacted communities, but also challenging what Ignacio Martin Baró would call the dominant lies that are told about communities that are impacted. And much of our work derives from liberation psychology and liberation theory from Latin and South America. You'll hear that in the talks. The third, again, is to honor the wisdom that is cultivated on the ground behind bars in quiet and marginalized communities, and to understand that the kind of knowledge that percolates in those communities might not sound like academic knowledge, but needs to be woven into the kind of science we engage. The fourth is that when we bring together research collectives, which you'll hear about on both projects, what Maria has called contact zones, where privileged people come together with impacted folks, maybe with lawyers, maybe with public health folks, maybe with artists, that we pool our knowledges, but we privilege the perspective of those most impacted. You will hear that clearly from Sharon, who is an amazing advocate of no research on us without us. Whatever number I'm on, maybe it's fifth, is that when one engages in critical par, we refuse downstream analyses. So much of social science is predicated on studying the consequences of injustice and often blaming the impacted community for those consequences. We make two moves. One is we're not just studying the consequences, we're trying to look at the origins. We're trying to look at who's privileged, who's benefiting. And also we will never make the mistake to assume that where the problems appear is where the problems are caused. And we learned that from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a brilliant sociologist at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, who was hired by University of Pennsylvania to study the Negro problem, why there's so much crime and disease and too many people living in households and illness and lack of education in the Black community. And he took the job in 1898 to study those problems, knowing that it was a racist framing that acted as though those problems were in that community and caused by that community. And he systematically studied the structures and policies and dynamics that placed those problems in that community, and then called on social scientists never to make the mistake again to assume that where one sees the negative consequences is where they are born. And yet social science reproduces that error over and over again. The sixth issue is that, as I indicated earlier, our research teams tend to be comprised of very differently situated folks. So Kate's a lawyer, Sharon's a social worker, Maria and I are social scientists. We all bring our own complex biographies. We bring situated knowledges. And in our projects, we work hard to craft questions and analyses that emerge from our intersections, not to assume that Kate, because she's the lawyer, has figured it all out, or Maria or I, because we have a PhD, or Sharon, because she's an MSW. We work hard, we privilege the perspective of those most impacted. However, we intend, and we are never disappointed. We intend and know that we will run into what the writer Gloria Anzaldúa calls choques, clashes, troubles, where if you dare to cross dangerous power lines, you're going to run into some places where we might clash. And for us, those are not always welcome, but they are times where we learn, because we all live in different spaces, and it's only when our perspectives come together that new knowledges can be born. So you will hear about some choques. And then finally, in CPAR projects, we have a deep sense of accountability. That is, we hold ourselves accountable to communities under siege, communities in struggle. And we're very clear that we produce products that are of use to those communities, also to policymakers, also to social transformation, also to social movements, and also to academic work that we all publish together. So there's a deep sense of complex accountabilities and audiences. I will leave you with those commitments. You will hear them echoing through the two cases. And I am happy to turn this over to my sister, friend, colleagues, Maria, Kate, and then Sharon. So Maria is going to take us into the Morris Justice Project. Both projects are rooted in commitments to justice. Both projects were founded with lawyers. Both projects honor the perspectives of those most impacted by injustice. And both projects have big dreams about social transformation and also intimate commitments to care, to solidarity, and to liberation in our most intimate relations. So Maria, you're on.
Thank you, Michelle. And thanks to everyone who's come together for this today. So I'm going to take you into a project that took place a few years back in the South Bronx, in a neighborhood that we all sort of renamed the Morris Justice neighborhood because of a Morris Avenue, a very long avenue that runs through it. And as you listen, if you can sort of hold some of the ideas that Michelle talked about in her introduction, and think about your own work and your own projects that you're involved with, there'll be a lot of particulars, some of which will maybe ring familiar, others might seem very different. But I encourage you to think about what pieces of the story that I'm about to tell might resonate or spark ideas for you in your own journeys. The project, oh, you're hearing my voice. Oh, hold on, oh, here we go. There we go. So I am one voice, but I'm actually one voice of many. These are all the folks that consistently over time worked on our project. We're all co-researchers. This is a group of people, young and old, most who are very comfortable having their names publicly connected to the work, but also some who prefer to remain anonymous. So you'll see in that list anonymous. And the project was started actually in 2011, a few years now back, and it was really a response. It was a collective response to an outrageous time in New York City, where the New York Police Department was using excessive amounts of what they called stop, question, and frisk, a policing strategy that was under an umbrella of what's called broken windows policing, which is a theory of policing that actually based on some very faulty social science, very lousy study, unfortunately, that was elevated, and its flaws were overlooked, and it convinced police departments in New York City and now sadly all over the country and even all over the world, that if you focus on very small, what they call quality of life crimes or offenses, that you can prevent larger crime, right? So if a community is full of broken windows, you're inviting in larger crime. That's sort of the general philosophy. So what it did is it gave permission, it encouraged police departments, or our police department, to target things like loitering, things like standing in front of building, trespassing, very small quote unquote offenses. And no surprise, it was really targeted and used in poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color in New York City. So when we got started, and this is the we in the moment is myself and my colleague Brett Stout, who's a professor also at the City University of New York. We were finding across in many of our participatory projects, as was Michelle and others that we work with, that young people were telling more and more stories of really outrageous and aggressive interactions with police, young people of color in particular. And alongside this, every day in the newspaper, you were just reading about more and more and more and more stops by the police. And these numbers, as they were escalating, you know, some of us were asking, you know, myself, Brett, those of us, the Public Science Project, we're trying to figure out, who are we in this? Like, where is our responsibility? What is how can we engage what is happening right now, and how can we help respond? At the same time, there were a group of actually mothers that we were introduced to by a lawyer who had been involved with them, representing them in a case against the city, trying to demonstrate the racial injustice in these policies. So you see the woman in the bottom there with her son, that's Jackie Robinson. She, along with Nadine and Fawn, who are in black leather jackets in that group photo, they were three mothers that we met in this neighborhood who looked at us, Brett's in the beige jacket there, and said, I don't know about this idea of research. Never really done it before, but you know, we had a lot of passion and a lot of energy. We talked to them about the work that we had done, our interest in wanting to do something around policing, specifically in a neighborhood, to sort of look at the consequences of these policies. They were fed up with the police harassing their children, their sons. So together we met lots of folks in the neighborhood. They introduced us to folks. We met folks on our own, and we launched an open meeting at the library. Oh, sorry, let me just show you. So for those of you who are not from the East Coast, New York City is made up of 5 boroughs. This is taking place in the southern tip of the Bronx, which is one of the boroughs, sort of right where that red star is. And for those of you who are baseball fans, it's about 6 blocks east from Yankee Stadium. That was the neighborhood that we sort of connected up to. It's a neighborhood that was experiencing at that time, I don't know if you saw, there were 700,000 police stops the year that we got started. The heavy, heavy police presence all over the neighborhood, although it was also a neighborhood that was very vibrant, right? You had block parties in the summertime, cookouts, but the increase of police meant that it was becoming more and more difficult actually for folks to gather. So the numbers of barbecues were shrinking as the number of police vans were circling. It's a neighborhood many neighborhoods all around the city went through a process by which private and public buildings turned over their security to the New York Police Department under Operation Clean Halls and several other policies. Literally for $1 a year, landlords were able to turn over security responsibilities to the NYPD, and it allowed NYPD, the New York Police Department, to enter buildings and vertically sort of surveil them and do sweeps, which is where they started to arrest lots and lots and lots of people. All right. So who is the we? Again, asking the question. You heard about Brett and I, you heard about Nadine, Fawn, and Jackie. But we all had to sort of think together. As I said, we held this open meeting. Brett and I were not living in the neighborhood. We knew we wanted to center the experiences of folks who were. So we needed to figure out a way for us to connect up with each other and come to know each other and to trust each other. We all, as we were sort of growing as a group, we were wanting to think about, so Jackie, Fawn, and Nadine were like, well, we're moms, you know, they had their sons join in, sons' friends joined us. Folks wanted to have young people's voices involved because they felt they were particularly targeted. The group wanted to make sure that we had representation from shopkeepers and from elders so thinking about whose standpoints did we want to make sure were central to the research process, to help us think about what the best design might be, what were the best methods to use to understand how people were experiencing policing in that particular moment. We had to think through power and vulnerabilities, right? We had to think about how would it work for all of us to come together with our very different experiences so that we could participate as equally as possible in the process, right? What conditions did we need to sort of set so that, again, we could build trust and build meaningful participation? All right, we had to answer questions like, who is the community? What is the neighborhood, right? These are terms that we throw around, but we really had to unpack them. And on our very first day, we kind of drew a map and said, okay, so if you live in the neighborhood, what does that mean? And we decided that it meant that you either had to live, work, or go to school in these 42 blocks between these 161st Street and Park Avenue or 167th Park Avenue. And so, and we also had to think about why research? What was the purpose of our work? Why were we coming together from very different experiences and very, what were our commitments? Who were we responsible to? And it became very clear in our conversations that we wanted to first and foremost speak back to the NYPD, the New York Police Department, and to the mayor, right? They were dominating the conversation. They were trying to convince New Yorkers that this incredible sort of attack on communities of color was necessary to keep our city safe. And our project, the residents that became our research colleagues, wanted to speak back to that, wanted to create data that could stand alongside the New York City Police Department data. We also wanted to really engage the community where folks were living, right? So our team was living within the Morris Justice neighborhood, and they wanted to speak to their neighbors. They knew well that their neighbors knew what stop and frisk was, but they suspected that they knew their own experiences and their friends or maybe their family members, but we wanted to sort of be able to look at the neighborhood as a whole, right? To really sort of see what was happening to each other, even folks that we passed by, but we don't know intimately. And then the third sort of purpose or goal for our work was really to speak to folks in the city who weren't being policed in the same way, right? Who were being fed these rationales and justifications by the police department, but weren't living the consequences. Okay, because the New York City Police Department had this giant quantitative data set, our group wanted to create a parallel, and we wanted to create a large, as large as possible data set, and for it to be mainly quantitatively driven. And so because of that, we decided to do a survey. Whatever methods projects adopt are really because of the context that they're working in. What is the purpose of the work? And that helps you think about what kinds of data, what kinds of evidence will be useful to sort of move the audiences that you're hoping to move. So for us, it meant a survey. And we, so the group did a lot of knowledge sharing We did that in lots of different kinds of ways. We looked at citywide data that was already in existence, the police department data that the lawyers forced the department to release. We thought about, we shared again our own stories. We shared ways that we learned about policing through music, for example. So at one point we made a mixtape as we were trying to think about where were the lessons around policing and the history of policing, and where did our own sort of understanding of that develop. So we sort of built and expanded our own knowledge bases and our collective knowledge in a wide variety of ways, well beyond sort of traditional research practices of reading journal articles or books or talking to quote unquote recognized experts. We also held lots of focus groups with other community members that we felt like maybe our internal group didn't represent so well. And from all of these conversations, we developed themes, as you would when you're developing a survey. And then from the different themes, so here's an example. So general police and crime themes from one of our many conversations. And then we would take out each one of these and sort of blow them up and then sort of unpack, well, what does it mean that the police are present at all the wrong times, right? From those, we've developed questions. Sometimes we did seek advice from, in this case, a group of lawyers that were really interested, like we were wanting to show the collateral consequences of these policies, right? That it wasn't just an individual stop the way the mayor was talking about it, that one stop actually involved a whole network, a whole set of family members, or, you know, it meant lost time at work. The repeated rescheduled court visits meant grandparents who had to, again, you know, sort of reprioritize their lives in order to, and then very often the cases were dismissed. So we wanted to capture all that. So working with lawyers, we made this very elaborate way to do that we were very proud of, went through many, many drafts, right? We brought it to a group of advisors who were, again, more members of the community, clergy, organizers, social workers. They looked at our draft, tried to take it and said, there's no way this will work on a street corner. So we had to, you know, lick our wounds and rejigger things over and redraft over and over again. We had to think through very carefully, who was it that we wanted to talk to? How could we produce data that would, and this is, you know, we can unpack this later, but that might be seen as legitimate and not easily dismissed by those in power, right? In this case, the police department and the mayor's office. Whose stories do we want to make sure that we captured, right? Who has been left out that we needed to make sure that our work was representing, whose experiences. Again, this is not the case for all participatory projects, critical PAR projects. For us, because we knew that we would be under attack, or rather that one of the ways that our work might be dismissed is that maybe there would be critique that our work wasn't rigorous enough, that our sampling wasn't random enough, right? And so we tried to respond to that by being as random as possible in our sampling. And by sampling, meaning when we were out asking folks to take the survey. So we carved up the neighborhood. We took a map that we printed out from, you know, Google Maps, and we drew little quadrants or sections of it. And then each day we went out to hand out the survey, which we did over 3 months. We got over 1,000 folks who were living in these 42 blocks. And we would stand in that section all day long on a Wednesday or a Saturday. We sort of shifted it up during the week. And then within that, because we were being so extra careful, we selected one building. So you see that one image there with a star on that building. So we would randomly select a building and stand in front of that building. So one of us would be there the entire time trying to catch every single person who's in or out. And then we would compare that data to the data from that section to see if, you know, there were any major discrepancies. We didn't want people to dismiss us to say like, oh, you only ask people who hate the police, or you only got friends of friends of friends who have particular experiences. And as you can see from the triangles on the bottom there, we actually did get a fairly representative sample of the neighborhood itself. All right, so I'm just going to give you some images, and this is just sort of detail so that your head can be sort of filled with possibilities, right? So here we are, again, the design of the project was participatory, thinking about the methods that we would use, developing those methods, so creating that survey. And then we also, in part of the analysis, right? We didn't want to our project did not want to replicate research that had been going on for decades in that particular neighborhood, or really all over the South Bronx, where researchers, sometimes very well-intentioned, come in and sort of gather up their data, sort of harvest their data from folks, and then leave and make their arguments and never really return back or ever sort of inform folks about what they found, what they learned, and what happened. And this project actually was the very opposite, right? Very much taking seriously that no research about us without us. The research team, held everything, including the analysis. And so here are images of taking one section of the survey where we asked about police experiences, positive and negative. And we had to make some decisions around sort of as we were starting to aggregate the data so that we could make claims about people's, sort of their experiences with aggressive contact, right? Or helpful contact with the police, experiences with the police. And that proved really difficult because we had to sort of tease apart. So if you were, say, what constitutes a violent experience with the police? Is it being thrown against a car? Is it being strip searched? Is it being, questioned at gunpoint, right? Some things felt very clear, others not so clear when it was within the definition of what police can do. And then is that a distinction? If it's not violent in the framing of police behavior, of the sanctioned police interactions, but it feels violent to the person who's experiencing it, right? But so we had to sort of figure those things out, and we literally just like would cut this up, as you can see, and then start to group things. And then we had lots of debates within us. And as Michelle said, it was in our disagreements that we actually started to really unpack the nuances of what it meant to be policed under these policies. Folks took the survey very, very seriously. We were very mindful of not trying to create a very long survey, which proved to be very difficult actually, because we had so many questions that we wanted to ask folks, and each of us, had our own sets of questions. But folks really, really took the survey seriously. We offered folks a round trip Metro card, transportation on the subway. And folks often would sort of happily take the card, and then they would take the survey and they'd give the card back to us and say, you know what, actually give this to somebody who needs it. All I want is for you to take the survey and give it to the mayor. It was very clear to folks that this was a survey made by their neighbors, and sort of by participating, people were feeling like they were joining a very grassroots movement against what was happening in their lives, that our survey asked things that folks they felt like were not talking about. And you can see where people were writing in on sort of on the margins of the survey to try to express as much as they could, and even pushing back sometimes at the more quantitatively sort of framed questions where they really wanted to underscore their experiences. We did all of our analysis was really done together, and the few times that we tried to sort of speed up our work and do it separately, folks would text us and say, actually, I think we need to come together. In this case, we were looking at signs where people were talking about what keeps their neighborhood safe. So we were doing a thematic analysis, and we tried to do it at home, and our group had a rebellion, and we had to come back together because, in fact, people really thrived on putting out their ideas, being challenged, and sort of refining them. And when they were doing it at home on their bed, they were missing out in that part of the sort of conversation that really provoked their thinking, our collective thinking, that sharpened our thinking. We had disagreements among ourselves and even within the data, right? So there was a lot of sort of evidence in the data that people did not necessarily trust the police, sorry, my thing is like on a timer, did not necessarily understand police presence as that their neighborhood had sort of more quote unquote crime, but at the same time would say that they felt safer when police were around. And so we went back, we took some of our what we felt like contradictory data, and Xeroxed it all up and brought it back to the same streets that we were handing out the survey in, where people took it, and asked folks to help us interpret and make sense of these seeming contradictions. Again, to kind of peel back, not to make assumptions that we knew, even though we had our own personal feelings about the police. And actually in our group, they really ranged. Some folks were, abolition. We don't need any more policing. Other folks were like, no, we want police. We remember what it was like to live in a neighborhood where the police never came. And what we need is policing with dignity and respect. I think over time, the belief that there could be policing with dignity and respect was a difficult position to hold. But still, it really was a conversation that was ongoing. So what you see here is we started doing that community level analysis that we did really was exciting for us. We had really wonderful conversations, and so it provoked us to start doing what we called sidewalk science. And we would start to take our findings. So here you see Fawn, and she's chalking up. This is a statement that somebody wrote in the survey. Why do I always fit the description? It's often what police would say to folks when they were stopping them, and people would ask why, and they would say, you fit the description. And then others, like you also see at others, 75% of the neighborhood people, of the neighbors in this neighborhood have been stopped by the police. So to try to draw people in to basically this, so installations of our findings on this, again, the same street corners where we handed out the survey. And these were actually kind of beautiful moments where folks would pass by, again, just folks living in the neighborhood, and we got to say like, hey, you remember that survey you took? Here's what we learned. What do you think? And so it was like a sort of building in organizing and popular education and community, and just recognizing people's right to engage deeply in the conditions that they're living. So what you just saw, just go back once. So folks, the conversation about community safety was one that just kept reemerging over time in our project. And so we built in an added feature. We sort of took one of the questions from the survey and sort of animated it a little more, and started to ask folks when they would come to the sidewalk science sessions, what kept their community safe. And what does community safety look like? I think that was the prompt. And then we gave folks a whiteboard, stealing from other popular educators, and they would write their response. Some folks did it anonymously and covered their faces. Other folks, like this woman, grabbed her child and wanted to make sure she was in the photograph as a resident in the neighborhood. And then we took two pictures. We'd give a picture to the person who shared with us, and then we took the other picture and we started to build. Sorry, I thought that was an image. Yeah, we started to build these sort of like a museum of community safety. And folks would come up and say, oh, I know her. And, sort of like add their ideas to this growing museum of and growing wall of ideas that were generated from the neighborhood itself. Again, we had maps. So here you see a map that has dots. So the larger the dot, the more stops. And again, this allowed folks to take their own lived experiences. My colleague Jackie, who also took the survey, many of the folks on the research team also took the survey because they wanted to make sure their data, their family's experience, their own personal experience were included. And she said like that, I am that data, like, to be able to see yourself in that map and then to think, whoa, like that's where my building is. And at my corner, I knew there were a lot of stops, but I didn't realize there was 400 last summer. To sort of really sort of deepen their own understandings of their experiences. All right, so I'm just going to run through some different products that we came out with. A lot of critical part projects, again, in the same way that methods and design really are a result of conversations about the purpose of the work and why you're engaging it in the first place, what you're hoping to get out of that. So too are the products and thinking through the audiences that you have for the work. This particular project was really born of outrage and a sense of urgency. And as a result, all of our products for the first few years really went to the lawyers who were fighting to stop this practice of policing and to demonstrate how discriminatory it was against people of color in the city and poor people. And we also wanted to, so there was no academic writing in the first few years. Our report that we produced we called it a back pocket report. So it could be folded up and held in the palm of your hand and put neatly into your pocket if you wanted. On one side, it was a poster of the qualitative and quantitative findings that we felt were most important. And then sort of in the folded portions, there were different stories of the project. So one introduced ourselves to the readers and sort of talked about how we got started. One was an open letter to the New York Police Department. Another was this comparison of the neighborhood that we had done the work in, the Morris Justice neighborhood, and a neighborhood in the East Village where my colleague Brett Stout had been living during most of the time of this project. And the comparison between the neighborhoods came up a lot in our research meetings because of the dramatic differences of how people in those areas were policed. It turned out we did an analysis of the police data together, and we saw that there was actually much more sort of contraband. There were more guns, there was more drug arrests, or not produced from arrests in the East Village, which was whiter, younger, and wealthier near NYU, New York University, than there was in the South Bronx. However, the people were being more aggressively policed in the South Bronx. So there were many more frisks, there was many more searches, there was much more sort of aggressive police context and many more stops in the Bronx. All right, so just some other images. We made T-shirts and buttons at block sort of parties and gatherings with the data. So everything was really, coming from the data to sort of get the conversations going and circulating. We made little videos of our data where we read pieces of, findings and statistics that took, in short little videos to pass around. We had this incredible opportunity with the Illuminator, which is a group of artists that project. And so they offered to project our data up onto a building. And so one night in the fall, we gathered and we made a 2-minute, actually it was a PowerPoint. We hoped to make a video, but it turned out to be just a PowerPoint, but you couldn't really tell. It looked like a giant bat signal, but it was an open letter to the NYPD that we built from our data. That was really pretty amazing. We were regulars sort of at the courthouse while the cases were being discussed in the courthouse or being fought. Again, all with our data, things that were coming from, it's not a crime to be who you are. Somebody had written that into the survey. And then just two last ways which we tried to sort of keep the conversation really open and alive. At the sort of tail end of our project, the New York City got a new mayor. There was a mayoral election and Bill de Blasio won. And part of his campaign was convincing the city that he would end stop and frisk. And it was a very sort of key piece of his election campaign. However, once he got into office, he installed or hired a police commissioner that was one of the architects of broken windows, of the sort of framework that stop and frisk falls under. And they, in the new administration, they really dialed back the use of the phrase stop and frisk and started to really refer to the policing sort of programs that they were using or theory of policing as broken windows. And people in the neighborhoods didn't know, and in our neighborhood, didn't really know from broken windows. So all of a sudden the papers where it was stop and frisk all over the place, now there's no discussion of stop and frisk. People are still being stopped in really high numbers. And all of a sudden there's this broken windows that doesn't even resonate. You don't even know that's what they're talking about, right? So our group, who knew very well the connection, wanted to make sure and felt a sense of responsibility. So we created these posters of our research team members. We were actually going to invite folks in from the neighborhood to stand for the paintings, but people were afraid they might get vandalized and felt ethically funky about inviting people in only to have their faces kind of, with graffiti on them. So the artist that had been working with us as a trade, he wanted to learn about, Evan Bissell wanted to learn about participatory methods and to deepen his participatory practice. So we invited him in, and then in exchange, he helped us develop these posters that we wheat pasted all over the neighborhood. And made into small flyers that people hung on their buildings.
Maria, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure we have enough time just to get through the rest of the panel. This is so fascinating and engaging. I'm loath to interrupt you, but maybe if you could just wrap up in another minute or so, that would be fantastic.
Perfect. So the last thing that I'll share was another open letter. We wrote a lot of open letters. And this time we tried to address the folks who were coming into the neighborhood around game days at Yankee Stadium. And it turned out that when we looked at the police data, there were more arrests on game days. And for those of you who don't live in New York City or have never been to Yankee Stadium, on game days, about 40,000 people from outside the neighborhood come in. We wanted to be able to open up a conversation with them around what was happening and to sort of debunk the myths about the neighborhood as being a dangerous place, and to undermine the argument that we needed to have these kinds of policing policies in order to keep the city safe. And instead, we talked about what we learned from the survey and what we had learned from our research, that really what the neighborhood was in need of was, quality schools and affordable housing and living wage jobs, and those were the things that kept a neighborhood safe, and it sort of reintroduced the people of the neighborhood. And so I can send you copies of these, but these are our artist friend helped us adapt the Yankee symbol into the broken windows symbol. Folks kind of didn't really pay that much attention and like kept grabbing them from us and taking them from us. And inside that card it's like a card, and it has an image of our colleagues, and also sort of an open explanation that sort of speaks truth to power. And so thank you for listening to this, and I look forward to our conversation afterwards.
Great, thanks so much, Maria. So we don't have a lot of questions. We have one question from Stevie, which is, I think, more focused on how to mobilize resources internal to organizations about investing in human resources and funding to support data collection in-house, not necessarily for reporting to donors. I'm happy to have you respond to that, but I also want to crowdsource that a little bit, because we have so many folks on this call who I'm sure are actively engaged in finding better ways within their organizations to collect data and to support that. And I would encourage you to put your suggestions into the chat in order to provide some insights from your work from participants. Maria and I think Michelle as well, one thing we know is when you fight power, power fights back. And one of the challenges around power, I think, has largely been around legitimacy, right? And whether that's from the perspective of policymakers or electeds or other researchers in the social science field. I'm wondering how, just in a sort of pithy statement, you would suggest folks to approach that question, which they may not face up front, although that's certainly possible, but certainly probably throughout engagements like this, they're going to get. So I'm hoping to source from your experience how you've responded to that, and in fact how you've kind of flipped it on its head in the work that you're doing.
Michelle, I've been talking a lot. You want to go ahead?
Sure. So, I know that question exists in the world. We don't actually get that kind of pushback a lot. But in the abstract, there's this question of, is participatory action research rigorous? And as I said in the beginning, it's not a method. So you can have a rigorous survey, a rigorous set of interviews. I think the most offensive part of participatory action research is that it dares to acknowledge that the people who have been most affected by injustice are experts on those systems of injustice. I think because it challenges epistemic hierarchies or academic credentials. But certainly my colleagues, those who would critique PAR would say, well, the people in prison don't really know that much about. I think that's where the rub is. So I think it's a bit of a diversion when it comes out as a question of method, because there is no singular method attached to PAR. But we do, because Mars Justice submitted data for the Floyd stop and frisk case, went on to present at the Citizen Science Fair at the White House. Jackie Robinson, one of the lead researchers, became one of the lead plaintiffs in one of the Floyd cases, because we publish in law reviews and in other academic journals. We are actually interested in being rigorous, but for us, rigorous means having resonance to life on the ground. Mm-hmm. And in terms of mobilizing resources, I do a lot of work with lawyers, and as an expert witness, and I never agree to be an expert without doing a piece of participatory work. Right now, we're working with kids in Baltimore who go to terribly disinvested schools. You just learn so much more when you dare to recognize the expertise that lives on the ground, and that understands that the disinvestment in schooling is related to the overinvestment in policing, that the lack of dignity that one experiences in school is manifest in social relationships and financial commitments. You'll hear in the Survivors Justice Project, we just know so much more for having, I think, 9 women who had been incarcerated, many of whom are survivors of domestic violence, at the center of shaping the research. I mean, Kate, Marie, and I are cool, but there's lots of things we don't know. And if one dares to be humble, the piece of work one can do by pooling those resources is so much stronger. And every time I've worked with lawyers or social scientists on projects like this, everybody has to agree that the analysis is more complex, the contradictions are thicker, but the context validity and construct validity is stronger, because we actually know the complexity of the issues. So.
Great, thanks so much, Michelle. And I'm going to ask you to hold the mic and introduce the next project and presenters, if you would.
Okay, so the next project is, I love Mars Justice, but this is the coolest project. And the Survivors Justice Project is, well, let me just say something about the space between the two projects. In some ways, Mars Justice was a way of excavating and animating the experiences in communities of color of state violence and aggressive policing, of a policy that everyone knew, but very few people outside of those communities knew the consequences. So it was about exposing state violence. This project, the Survivors Justice Act, is about animating the radical possibilities of a law that will only be radical possibilities if it can be amplified both inside prisons and outside, with women and men who are currently incarcerated, with communities that are vulnerable, with prosecutors, with lawyers, with judges, with journalists. And I will let Sharon and Kate develop that. But Sharon and Kate are 2 of the members of the Survivors Justice Project. Marie and I are also collaborating. This is a collaboration among multiple institutions: Columbia University Institute on Justice, the Women's Community Justice Association, Kate's at Brooklyn Law School. And we came together because this amazing law, generated mostly by women of color who were survivors of domestic violence and spent time in prison, knew that it was important to build legislation that would enable women on the inside to be potentially resentenced, and women going in to have the option of narrating domestic violence while they are being sentenced. But we also knew that, as amazing as that law was, and it was the struggle mostly of Black women with who had been impacted by the system, that it would only be good if there could be an organizing effort that helped women on the inside understand it, lawyers and community people on the outside. There are many organizations connected to DVSJA. We are one sisterly tentacle that hangs off of a large coalition. So the two people who are coming to talk to you about this project are both dynamic and amazing. Sharon White Harrigan is a reverend, a social worker, and she's the executive director of the Women's Community Justice Association. Kate Mogilescu is an unbelievably generous and brilliant lawyer who's been working on trafficking cases and really came to me early on and said, there's this new law, it's amazing, but can we create like a research project that animates its reach and builds its potential? And then COVID hit. So I'm gonna let them and women on the inside were locked inside without us actually being able to have access to deep conversation about the capacity of this law. So I'm going to turn it over to Sharon to give us the history a bit of the DVSJA and why it's so crucial that we remember that this law comes out of the struggle of women who know too much and too intimately. And then we'll turn it to Kate, who's been a lawyer deeply connected with both individual cases and very much the soul of the large research project. Sharon. You're on mute, sweetheart.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege to be a part of this, to be in community. And Michelle, you and Maria, and of course, my darling Kate, y'all are all just, I am just privileged to be in company with y'all in this. And so, what is the DVSJA? And I'm definitely gonna let Kate, when I pass it to her, for her to just, expound on it in a more profound way. However, it's a long fought legislation now that took over 10 years, that has now become law, that gives the judges discretion and the flexibility to sentence domestic violence survivors convicted of offenses related to their abuse to shorter sentences or an alternative to incarceration program. At the time when, during the origination of this bill, it was a post-conviction remedy, that became the intent, and it allowed the judges in narrowly defined circumstances the discretion to, again, sentence DV survivors and be able to even say, listen, they don't, why even go to prison, right? Just looking at firsthand the trauma behind what has gone on that has led them to this particular moment. So why is the DVSJA important? Why is it important? Because domestic violence affects women in prison in staggering numbers. 75% of women in the New York State prisons have suffered severe physical violence by an intimate partner during adulthood. And the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision found that 60% of women sent to prison for killing someone close to them were abused by the victim of the crime. And so all too often, the criminal injustice system response to DV survivors who act to protect themselves from abuses, violence is sent, the act to protect them from an abuser's violence is then sent themselves to prison, right? Often for many, many years, right? And this represents just a great injustice to the women who started out as victims themselves, but turned to be criminalized for protecting themselves. And instead of giving survivors who had suffered long shattering abuse, compassion and assistance, we wind up giving them harsh punishment and prison. And instead of providing protection, the criminal and justice system becomes just one more entity in the continuum of violence in survivors' lives, right? So what happens? The survivors are failed twice. They failed by not being protected in their abusive relationships, and secondly, by sending them to prison. And much of that lies with the fact that the law's mandatory sentences provisions force judges to send survivors to prison for long periods of time, right? Even when they think that an alternative to incarceration program or lower sentence is more appropriate. And again, I'm gonna let Kate, speak to that because that is her line of work. But what I do wanna say that as a survivor myself, as a person that not only have been in a domestic violence relationship, right, has also spent 11 years inside of a New York State prison, which is consequences of being in a DV relationship. And way too often, we as women have been overlooked, underrepresented, have never been brought to the table or given a platform. Since 1985, Bedford Hills Correctional has held a platform for women to testify about domestic violence. And it took so many years for us to come to this point right now, just to even bring to the forefront the need to have a law surrounding violence against women. What an atrocity to this, and in regards of, this has been going on for far too long. This has been going on forever, since the beginning of time. And there's simply just no protection. Even with the order of protections that once was given supposedly as a safety net and security for women, just never worked. It never worked in any shape, form, or fashion. Women were killed, right? Just by showing the piece of paper to their abuser. And so at every step and at every turn, women have been traumatized again and again, packaged trauma, compounded trauma, however you want to how you want to serve that up. But they have been traumatized again and again. And even with this law, as a person who has been a co-originator with this bill before it came law, the advocacy behind it for 10 years, it shouldn't have took 10 years. Right? It shouldn't have took over a decade for it to become a law protecting women, right? The same women who are the heart and the pulse of our community, the same women who, because of them, the family thrives, the same women who hold the men down, the same women who, runs the household and feed the children, and doggone it, put batteries in the remote control for the TV to work. We shouldn't have to take all of this time to think about protecting the women who are the hearts and pulse of the community. But we're thankful that this has now become a law, and just understanding that we still have a lot more to do, that the law is not perfect, but it's something to start with. And I just, I just say to everyone, I challenge all of you to just, understand what it is for women, right? The trauma that we endure, every single one of us. And it may be in a different capacity and in different ways in our lives and different aspects. But let me just make this clear, that domestic violence doesn't discriminate. And although the Black and the brown communities are affected the most for many different reasons, one being that we are, oppressed in the fabric of our DNA, right? But DV, domestic violence and intimate partner violence, affects us all, every single one of us. Doesn't matter your color, your race, your creed, your kind, doesn't matter, right? It touches every household, right? It can. And so just understanding what does that mean, right? If we know, if we directly impacted, or right, if we're affected because we know or suspect that someone close to us or around us is going through this. And so I just ask that, you know, everyone just really get informed about this law, get informed about domestic violence, because again, it touches everyone, may not be in the same way, but it does touch every single body, right? Around the world. Kate?
Thank you, Sharon. Hello, everybody. So I am Kate Mogilescu, and I'm going to sort of take us from passage of the law on through the creation of the Survivors Justice Project and how we're approaching our research, but also just like our life around this law, because this sisterly, what was it, Michelle? This sisterly tentacle, what are we? Whatever we are, hanging off as an appendage of another, like we are, this project is not only situated in the ideals and the philosophy that Michelle highlighted at the beginning of this session, but there is a tremendous amount of love and energy that's gone into the Survivors Justice Project that when we meet every other week, becomes very apparent. So the law went into effect in 2019, and Sharon is exactly right. What it does is it provides judges a way to look differently at sentencing for survivors of domestic violence. And this is groundbreaking for so many reasons. One, because the stranglehold that mandatory sentencing has on the criminal legal process, on outcomes, on how much time people are sent to prison for, cannot be overstated. And this law allows some give there, both at the front end, as you've heard, and also, most critically, at the back end, like looking backward for women and men who have been in prison for a very long time now have an opportunity to go back into court and seek resentencing. But how this works, who this impacts, and what happens all remains to be seen, right? The law went into effect in 2019, and very early on, I had a conversation with Michelle and Maria that was like, we have to not only document this moment, but we have to document it from a very specific perspective, one that you've heard a lot about already today, but one that is also grounded not only in the experience of directly impacted people, of course, but in a very critical place of our criminal legal system, right? We cannot simply, now that the law has been passed, turn to the courts and say, okay, great, like good, law's done, so everything should be fine, right? In terms of thinking about accountability for this system and coming at it with that critical lens is a fundamental part of our work. So we brought the Survivors Justice Project together early on in 2020, and I was sitting as I was watching Maria's slides of all the sort of in-person meetings and organizing and activity around the Morris Justice Project, and thinking that if we had a slideshow of our work in Survivors Justice Project, it would be a series of Zoom shots and Zoom screenshots and all of us on the phone, you know, talking on the phone with people in prison, on the phone with each other, on the phone, because we have been operating largely during the pandemic. But what we did as the research collective piece of this was we really centered our work around, okay, who in prison may be eligible to seek resentencing? How do we reach them, connect with them, make sure they know about this law, make sure they have resources to pursue resentencing, and make sure that the legal community at large that will be responsible ultimately for seeing these cases into court, for ushering them through the courts, have the appropriate lens, training, and perspective on this. At the beginning, the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision generated a list for us of all of the women who were in custody at the time the law went into effect that were serving sentences that would make them eligible for DVSJA relief. And what that means is they were serving sentences of 8 years or more for an offense that was included under the law. And I should pause and give a few other pieces of the sort of remarkable nature of this law. One, it applies to almost all of the most serious offenses in New York's penal law. It excludes murder one and a few other groups of offenses, but really it applies to offenses categorized as violent under New York's law. And these are the kinds of offenses and the kinds of sentences that are normally excluded from any reform effort, right? They're carved out as the worst of the worst, people that are sort of beyond reform, and therefore shouldn't be part of our efforts to decarcerate. The second piece is that although a lot of this is about people who are in prison for protecting themselves from an intimate partner abuser, the law actually recognizes that domestic violence and the impact of domestic violence is broader than that. It can be domestic violence at the hands of a family member, not just an intimate partner. So at the hands of a parent, another family member, a member of the same household. And that's something that has historically, it's been a very big blind spot in the criminal legal system, is how these other relationships, other family relationships that involve abuse impact people. Finally, the law also recognized that it doesn't just apply, or survivors aren't just criminalized for situations where they are protecting themselves from a direct attack. The notion of, for example, being compelled or coerced to engage in other offenses, right, which is part of an abusive framework. The law contemplates that. The law allows relief for that too. So survivors who are maybe compelled to engage in robberies at the behest of their abusers, drug crimes at the behest of their abusers, all of that is covered and considered by this law, and that really is unique. So when DOCS compiled the list of all of the women in custody as of July 2019 who may be eligible to get their sentences reduced, we set to work with that list. That list became our centering point. We realized that because these were women who had been convicted of some of the more serious offenses in the penal code, there likely was a lot of media about their cases and prosecutions. There likely were published court decisions or other things we could sift through to get a sense of what the cases and prosecutions were like. We created a database of these 487 cases, and we tried to sort of build out everything we would want to know about who might be eligible to benefit from this law, taking into account the experiences that we've talked about throughout this workshop today, right? What are the things that define the experience for the people who are most impacted? What are the things that they understand need to be elucidated, need to be made clear to lawmakers, prosecutors, judges, et cetera? What are the things that we can and should do as we're looking at this group of women? So we started to do that. And right when we started to do that, COVID hit. And because we had already put together this group, this collective of people coming in from so many different disciplines and with so many different perspectives, but many of whom had spent a number of years in New York State prison, many of whom had just been released very recently, there was an intimacy to the process of looking at this list. There was a familiarity and a network just built in that allowed us, when COVID hit, to shift very quickly from the tracking that we were trying to do under the DVSJA to, okay, what the hell are we going to do now? Because we have a pandemic, we have a virus that is killing people, and we have the women that we are communicating with, that we are looking at, that we are thinking about stuck in prison. So we were able to pivot very quickly because of the collective that we had brought together to start doing emergency clemency petitions, medical parole applications. So the line between research and practice, blurry. In that, one of the, I think, the amazing parts about the Survivor Justice Project is that, yes, it is a research collective. That's what brought us all together, is the opportunity to study and document and see what was happening with this law. But it is not passive. And there are ways in which we have approached learning about the group that may be eligible to the beneficiaries of this law has been very active and has involved advocacy beyond just research. And so thinking about that, I know I'm getting way towards the ends of our time together, but that was our COVID advocacy. And then as we've sort of now all learned to exist during COVID, and this has been our functioning now for several months, we went back to the list of 487 women. And we wanted to trace not just, okay, who was sentenced for how long, and what's the outcome of the resentencing application, but more than that, how does information travel now within the prisons? Who is reaching out to agencies for assistance and who is not? So we partnered with agencies across the state, the Office for Indigent Legal Services, the New York State Defender Association. Who's reaching out for help under this law? And are those people getting help? Of course, but then who's not reaching out for help? And is that an indicator of additional marginalization or stigma, even within the prison system? We started to build resources for people inside going through the process, recognizing that the process of seeking resentencing, going back and revisiting many parts of what needs to go into an application will be difficult. So what kinds of support do people need as they go through this process? Mostly taking this from once the law was implemented, it being sort of under the province of lawyers, right, to figure out who gets to seek relief and how do we do this, to making it well beyond that, to again situating the expertise outside of just lawyers or just social workers or just fill in the blank, to making sure that it really was comprehensive. Because one of the things that has been most important is pushing back against the notion that lawyers can be the gatekeepers to relief under the law. I want to make sure that I acknowledge the question from Kevin in the Q&A, and I'm reading it, so give me a second, but Sharon, Maria, Michelle, please jump in while I'm reading it to make sure, and fill in on anything else about sort of the work that is ongoing in our project that I've failed to mention so far.
Maybe, Kate, while you read that, there are a series of questions that Michelle's done an amazing job of responding to, but a number of them, which I think will go to you, Michelle and Maria, are around how do we do this, right? How do we fund it? How do we get started? Who do we reach out to? Are there, is this expertise embedded within academic institutions? Where do we look? I'm wondering if you could just kind of respond to that in aggregate for folks. I'm sure it's not the first time you've gotten that question, so it would be helpful for all of us to understand more about how to approach it.
Yeah. And
then Kate will come, you should answer that question, but we can also come back to Kevin's question.
Go ahead, Kate.
I mean, I think the unfortunate thing in thinking about funders and thinking about how to set out to do this, my answer, or the way we've done it, is maybe not as instructive or helpful, which is you do it on a shoestring and you push everyone beyond their capacity first, totally. And then you figure out how to get support after. One of the things about, I think this goes to sort of some of the legitimacy questions we were exploring earlier also, is how do you make it not just funded and resourced, but how do you make it legitimate to the audiences you're trying to move? Here, I mean, we were first in time, which is a huge part of it, but we are also like that intimate connection makes us the quickest on the draw and the most aware of what's going on. This doesn't really answer for folks that are thinking about how to seek resources, but that improves our legitimacy, which then in turn allows us to seek resources. So it sort of is a cycle, I think, but I would love for my colleagues to also address that.
Both of these projects started out with bupkis, very little money, and just a lot of passion and commitment and good friends and mobilization. And over time, they've both acquired more resources. But one of the things that happens is when you do participatory work and you tap into networks, is different kind of resources come to pass. I think Kate, certainly Maria, and I take seriously that the university has an obligation to do this kind of work. So we've pressured our institutions into that obligation. We've mobilized our students who are loving doing this kind of work. We brought the law students with the social science students with gender women studies. And at our first big dinner, we had a panel of experts, women who were inside, who could tell us about how domestic violence and incarceration, how they're linked. And then we went to a couple of funders for the big air table, where Babe Howell, who's a lawyer who helped us think through how to put data into this Airtable, where we took the 437 cases. And now other organizations have kind of joined in, offered up resources for people who want a direct conversation about how do you get universities mobilized. They should contact Maria and me at the Public Science Project. There's nothing magical about this except the experience of it is kind of magical. That it's not mysterious how one brings people together. And I do think we have to force our institutions. We've had to alter how CUNY thinks about IRB and funding, and do we pay our co-researchers as well as our participants? And if they're in prison, can we pay their families, right? So we've had to press those institutional borders. Is it ethical? We have to narrate why and how these kinds of practices are ethical. There are 1,000 annoying details about institutional roadblocks, but one needs the kind of chutzpah of social justice commitments that says, this is the work we have to do. And we've said, CUNY, you're a public institution, you have an obligation to do this work.
The only thing I would add to that is that, you know, very often it comes through just conversation and, you know, reaching out to folks, like sitting down together. We often start our projects with like dinners or lunches, or I think maybe because we like to eat, but also because we want to gather together and sort of where people have a moment to say, okay, this is who I am or who we are. This is where we stand in relation to this injustice. These are our commitments. These are our desires. And what are yours? And where folks, you know, come together because they're coalescing around, you know, their passion, their sense of injustice of what's going on, and then thinking about, again, how they're differently positioned to it, what they have to offer each other, and what their visions are, and then sort of like building from that, what their resources are, and resources broadly. I mean, resources are all kinds of things, and very often, you know, sadly, these projects don't start with a lot, but can gather steam. And often, if they're open, when they're open and thinking about if they're engaging research, you know, what that research can look like, or activism, then things come together. I mean, like, we've had incredible partnerships with people that, you know, in the beginning, we're not even really sure what we're doing together. And then these incredible things grow.
We've never had pushback from a funder when we've said, we're going to pay our co-researchers and we're going to pay all of our participants. No funder has ever said, we can't do that. We just want to pay you two.
Yeah, I don't know if we made clear. Yeah. All of our projects, you know, before we fund anybody, we fund, the minute we have a nickel, it goes to our, you know, research colleagues and our participants.
And I think so if I can address Kevin's question, which is really about like, okay, so how do you organize from the start to make sure a legislative accomplishment, a policy reform that once implemented, that we don't just all sort of walk away and say, okay, job well done. And I think here, you know, again, this is situated in deep and righteous distrust and cynicism about what the legal system is and how it operates. And so, like, starting from that perspective, you could never then rely, for example, on the Office of Court Administration to document and sort of promote accountability around a resentencing law, right? So where does that power have to live? It has to live in a deeply cynical and sort of cautious place. And so there, then, if we're talking about resentencing and we're talking about decarceration, we have to be looking at who's in the prisons, right? And who is part of this and who is excluded from this, and why, and what obstacles are put up to understand that and to follow that. And so, and again, that's the power of this collective, is the connections inside, the access I bring maybe as a lawyer, but the access others bring as people who are deeply familiar with this superintendent or this social worker or this person, allows that, and allowed us, for example, to connect with the women at Bedford who work at the law library, who, although they might not be seeking resentencing relief themselves, connect with so many others within the facility. And that grows our network, right? And then by building a resource guide for people going through the process, we're in direct conversation. The people building that resource guide are not only members of the collective on the outside, but women on the inside who we're in touch with. So it all just kind of continues to come together. I think we're at 4:29, so I will myself stop talking.
We're at 4:29, and I want to give Sharon the last word. Sharon, you have a lot of people watching this and interested and engaged. What would be the one thing that you would tell them to get them to take the next step to engage in this process and the set of commitments?
That's a good question. And to get them engaged in this process. I think that one of the things is to to get informed. The other thing is to, come on, we need to push these actions. We have these laws, we have these legislations that are out there that is created, but that doesn't mean that, they're going to follow through, right? That it's up to us, we the people, right, need to make it happen. And so, whether that means, I know that now we're in a time of COVID, it's upticking. We could write letters, we can make phone calls, we can, be a part of some of these coalitions and projects that are existing right now, and lend their expertise. We need funding. Let me repeat that. We need funding to help make it happen. And so I encourage everyone and anyone to put pen to paper. Let's flood the offices. Let's write to the courts. Let's, let's get active. I think that's, I think that we sit and we do very well sitting at panels and in events. And now that we have Zoom, we ain't even got to get dressed. We can just sit and just be present, but we're not active, right? And just whatever that means for you. I don't know what a person is, what they can actually do or personally have the capability or ability to do. But I just think that all the above, right? If you have the means, write a check. If you, have a good pen, write a letter. If you, have the time, come join us. We need to be activated. We need mobilization, right? We need people on fire. We need people to say no more. We need people to say that this is, our community, this is our life, and this is what we want to see. And how do we make that happen? It's we the people coming together, and we're stronger together, strength in numbers. And so we just need people to really not just want to know, but do something about it, and whatever that is for them.
Thank you. I can't think of a better way to end the session and to challenge ourselves than that testimony. I'm grateful, Sharon, Kate, Michelle, and Maria, for your time. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. And I'm going to turn it now over to Liz to wrap us up and take us into tomorrow. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you again to our incredible panel today, and Matthew for convening this vital conversation. And also would like to acknowledge Casey Mears from Pro Bono Net for being our live note taker during such a rich and dynamic discussion, and all of you for being here today and your thoughtful questions and deep engagement in these topics. So tomorrow, we will be building on these conversations with the day-themed design and technology strategies to advance community-centered justice. And those, we will have 3 sessions focusing on creating design practices alongside and with communities that not only focus on helping people impacted by justice issues access existing justice systems, but to also shape laws and policies that impact them. And I am very excited about the session we will open with tomorrow, which will include keynote remarks from Antoinette Carroll, the founder and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab, and an initiative that was founded in support of the uprising in Ferguson in 2014, and today is building a youth-led, community-centered movement to challenge racial and health inequities. That session also will be interpreted simultaneously in Spanish, so please feel free to share information about that and the rest of this week's events with any others in your programs or communities that might be interested. So thank you all again, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow.